In making the series, what did you learn about the reasons for the hatred that made these atrocities possible?
Well, I mean, that's a huge question. I mean, I think one could certainly divide it into thinking what were the motivations from many of the former Nazis who I met about why they were able to go along with this. And that's slightly separate, I think, from looking at more on the ground the level of collaboration that happened in individual countries. But certainly if you're looking at, I think, the reasons that I learnt from the former Nazis I met, I think that it's what seems to have happened is that the Jews became a kind of almost a buzzword to represent a whole series of values that they disliked and hated. It wasn't just that they had traditional anti-Semitism in Germany and that the Nazis cleverly built on that. It was within them there was this cataclysm of the end of the First World War of trying to rationalize how that had happened, and so they sought a scapegoat. And so they thought, well, the Jews must be responsible. There's some hidden way in which Jews, either in government here or through some form of international financial conspiracy that they fantasized about, they must have been responsible. It's much easier to try and find a scapegoat for your troubles than look elsewhere. So that really built on it. But then it was, I think, that the Jews came to represent other values they disliked, like, for example, industrialization. In Germany, a number of Jews ran big industrial concerns or ran big, even department stores. The Nazis were very, very much in favor of the kind of lower middle class Germans and village life and so on. So the Jews became focused in their hatred of the cities. So a whole basket of values came together to make these the people who they felt, if they could remove somehow, they'd have a better society. And overwhelmingly, above all this, was a profound racial belief that Germany would be a sick country as long as these people were there. So I think that was going on with the Nazis. When you start to look at why did so many other countries cooperate, there were a variety of reasons, but certainly on the ground, with many of the locals, the villagers and so on I met who actively helped, whether in Lithuania or the Ukraine or in Slovakia, say, with the Linke Guard. Actually, an awful lot of that motivation was very simple, I think, which was economic, which is we benefit. What happens is that actually we get richer because if these people go, we can take what they had.
Two things seem to come out of the series very powerfully: that people learned to live with death and that the will to survive became paramount. What did you take away from making the series about the strength of people who were inmates of Auschwitz?
Well, certainly the people who we managed to interview who survived are really extraordinary people, obviously. One Polish political prisoner said to me, when I commented on how extraordinary it had been that he'd managed to survive, he said, well, the thing you've got to remember is what I learned was human beings can get used to anything, which I think is a very chilling thought, but there is an element that you can find in this history that tells you that. But there's something else we've got to remember about this, I think, which is that 1.3 million, 1,300,000 people roughly were sent to Auschwitz, and 1,100,000 of them died there. So the people who we feature in the series who survived are by definition exceptional people. They aren't the norm. The normal experience of going to this place was to die. So in a way, if we were going to show the correct proportionality, those are the people whose voices we would need proportionately more to hear. And I know some people will find it an extremely upsetting series to watch, but there's an argument that it should be more upsetting, because actually the voices of the people that we can't hear in a way really would demonstrate the absolute true horror, which is what it was like to be somebody sent here and to be dead within a matter of hours of arriving. What were those? We'll never know. No one came out of the gas chambers to tell us.
Now, it wasn't just Jews who were targeted. Russians and Gypsies also died in huge numbers. Why is it that Auschwitz is associated mainly with Jewish deaths?
Well, I think for one, there's a very good reason that Auschwitz is rightly associated mainly with Jewish deaths, which is of the 1,100,000 people who died there, 1 million of them were Jews. So again, proportionately, there's no question about the importance of the the tragedy for the Jewish people that happened there. But in a way, if that's all people know about it, it obscures the origins of the camp. It makes it look like there was only one picture, there was one snapshot of it, and this was the totality of the experience, which isn't right. And they grew towards this. So Auschwitz was never, in fact, built or opened as part of the anti-Jewish actions. It was built for Polish political prisoners. It then came almost a prism, it became rather a microcosm of the whole Nazi state, because the Nazis didn't just hate Jews, as you say rightly, they hated gypsies, they wanted to be rid of the gypsies, they wanted to terrorize the Poles, there were a number of homosexuals sent there were a number of Jehovah's Witnesses sent to Auschwitz. So it became really this almost catch-all to represent all of the various hatreds that the Nazis had.
The French and English handed over Jews, and anti-Semitism seemed terrible everywhere. Why didn't the authorities on the Channel Islands refuse to hand over their Jews in the same way as the vast majority of Danes refused to cooperate?
Well, it's certainly the case, whether we want to say the English, but certainly it's the case that the British on the Channel Islands did hand over, or whether you call people on the Channel Islands British members of the United Kingdom handed over people, and so did the French. And the first thing to say about that is, of course, they couldn't be sure what was going to happen to them. They're not handing these people over knowing for certain that they're going to be murdered, although they did all know clearly how much the Nazis really hated the Jews, and there were a number of cases where it was made plain by the people being sent that they certainly felt they were going off to some terrible fate, whether it was going to be murdered or whether it was going to be forced labor in the East or whatever, but they knew that they believed they were going to a terrible fate, and they didn't hide that from the people who were deporting them. There's a number of reasons, I think, why you can point to the French experience and the experience in the Channel Islands being different from the later Danish experience. The first is timing, which is in the spring of 1942, it was less well known. It was that these terrible things were going to happen. But by the autumn of 1943, I think it was more generally known, which was when the Danes were asked to give up their Jews. It was more generally known about the fate that would befall the Jews. It's partly geography. It was easier for the Danes because there was a neutral country nearby. So there's those factors. But also, one's got to say, I think, that there's also another element, which certainly in Denmark was an incredibly strong tradition of belief in human rights, of having a culture of a country that would be all together, that there was a simulation of the Jews there was no sense of the other, and so on. And the reason I think that's hugely significant is that if you look at the French and on the Channel Islands, it's no accident that the Jews who were given up on Guernsey were all foreign Jews. The Nazis asked for foreign Jews, and they went. In fact, no Jew who was born on the Channel Islands was ever sent. The Nazis specifically targeted and asked them to give up foreign Jews. In France, in the negotiations to hand over Jews, the French were reticent to hand over French Jews, and in the end became prepared to hand over foreign Jews who were in France. And again, I think you see this sense of the other. It was easier for these authorities to think of giving up people who weren't them. And I think that's something we can learn from it.
Now, the horror didn't end once the camp was liberated. Women returning home were raped and people's homes had been repossessed. Why did the horror continue?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. I think that certainly it's only really since the fall of the Berlin Wall that we're beginning to get more of a picture about the level of atrocities that was committed by Red Army soldiers as they were coming through into Germany and in the immediate aftermath of the war. And the knowledge that these people didn't differentiate in some cases between the German women they wanted to rape and the former prisoners they would rape is totally shocking. But I think it's a statement of the brutalization of the times and what had happened to these people. They just fought their way through the most brutal conflict in the history of the modern world. Roughly 27 million Soviet citizens had died, and the army was clearly not, aspects of the army, sections of that army were clearly not disciplined, and they didn't differentiate. So I don't think it's not a concerted policy. It's just an example, yet again, of how terrible things can happen in war.
Some people equate the Holocaust with the use of the atomic weapon. Are they comparable?
Again, that's a huge question. Certainly, it's striking that virtually all of the former Nazis I've met, this shared also with Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, who wrote his memoirs before he was hanged. What they all point to is how can you want to imprison us, want to put us on trial, want to have this vilification of us for what happened in places like Auschwitz, when look at the aerial bombing of Dresden, look at the targeting of Hiroshima, not just nuclear weapons, but look at, for the Germans, of course, it wasn't nuclear weapons, it was the big firebombing of the cities. What's the difference? What's the difference between children being incinerated in Dresden and children being incinerated in Auschwitz? That's what they say. That's what they will say to you. I think it's a profoundly specious, wrong argument. They cannot be equated, those things. And the reason I think they can't be equated is because if there had been a better way, if you like, if there had been the techniques of aerial bombardment we have now, I don't think anyone would have deliberately targeted women and children. There was no sense in the targeting of the cities by bombing that what you were looking for was one specific group of people who you isolated and want to eliminate from the face of this earth. There's no sense of that. There's a sense that what you're doing is trying to end a war. The bombing would have ended instantly if the war, if the Germans had surrendered. The persecution of the Jews would not have ended instantly if the Germans had reached a peace or reached an agreement and still the Nazis had still been in power at the end of the war. So there simply is no equation in my judgment between the two, and to try and equate it is almost to try and confuse and minimize the crime that happened in places like Auschwitz.
To what extent is the concept of an illegal order understood by today's armed forces?
The image we have of Nazis, the image I was taught in the press before I kind of met a number of former Nazis, was that the thing they'll say when you say, how could you pull the trigger, how could you do this, is to say, I was acting under orders. What's really been fascinating to me over the years is I've never met one former Nazi who has ever said that. But I've met a number of people who committed crimes for Stalin. I met a number of people who committed crimes in the Japanese Imperial Army in China and against our prisoners of war. And their first response is to say, I was acting under orders. What could I do? They would have shot me if I hadn't done it. That's it. So they just simply blank out a lot of these people when you try and get to motivations. That hasn't been the case with the former Nazis I've met. The vast majority of them say, at the time, I believed that what I was doing was right. So there's, I think, what psychologists call a greater degree of internalization of belief. They believe it was right at the time, which is why ultimately, I think the study of the Nazis, for me at any rate, has been more important. Because to try and get to the root of what was behind this internalization, that they actually say, I think it was right. At the time, I think it was right. When confronted with, even now, when confronted with a terrible crime, they might say, well, looking back, I can see that there was mistakes, the propaganda and so on may have helped me believe it, but at the time I believed it was right. That's what makes it so, for me, their motivation so ultimately terrifying.
What's the series taught you in making it about the Nazi mind?
It was really fascinating for me to learn a lot about Stalin's regime when I was doing a series and a book about the war between Hitler and Stalin. That really informed me in my thinking about the Auschwitz series and the mentality really of many of these Nazis. And that's because there is a level of fear and oppression within that regime that you never knew who was going to be targeted. You never knew. I remember one Soviet officer saying to me, we'd have these regular sessions where you'd had to stand up and denounce somebody at them as an enemy of the people. He said, we all knew they weren't enemies of the people, but you were worried if you didn't stand up and denounce somebody as enemy of the people, they would get up and do you. So it was just a desperate sense of terror. That didn't exist within the Nazi state. unless you were specifically targeted by the regime, completely unfairly, of course, because you were a gypsy, because you were a Jew, and so on, but unless you were targeted by the regime or you were an opponent of it, there was a way in which the majority of people could live relatively, it's still a oppressive police state, but relatively free from that level of fear that's under Stalinism. And what that did, I think, was give, this was up until the last days of the war, it changed, but this was certainly up until Stalingrad, I think. What that did was allow people a sense that they themselves were being responsible about what was going on. And that's something that I don't think many people know. I think there's a more comfortable way of looking back at this history, which is that everybody had a gun to their head. And it may be after the war you want to say that we did everything because if we were forced to, what could I do, and so on. I don't think that's the true historical reality of Nazism at all.